Anyway, so I was thinking about this idea of really trying to expand on what we've been talking about and dealing with, the hope that Christians have and why we have that hope, and it's based in faith. And so I brought up that article this morning where the Harvard study showed that people who attend regular religious services have a less likelihood to face deaths of despair through either suicide or alcoholism, opiate addiction, or whatever it may be, based upon the fact that they have connected to something that sustains them. And I think that is especially true in these studies, at least in regards to turmoil in individuals' lives. For us as Christians, we realize that whether or not we're having difficulties, turmoils in our life, our faith in God sustains us always, right? It doesn't take a bad time for all of a sudden to go, oh, I need God to sustain me. We trust in God sustaining us every day, whether things are going bad or whether they are good. And so all that stems from, for us, this strength that we have, stems from our faith in God. And as I said this morning, it is not a wishful thinking type of faith. It is a faith that is based upon evidences. It is supported and that we believe, as you look through the Word of God, that there has never been an argument given that would persuade me not to believe that God exists and that Jesus is his son. And believe me, you don't have to, but just as a statement, I have researched high and low in regards to these things, looking at Christian evidences, looking at the historicity of the Bible, the reliability of the text. Those are things that I've studied through the years and have yet to find someone who, or something that would prove that God doesn't exist and that I shouldn't believe in Jesus. And I know that one of the simple answers that someone might give you is, well, you just don't believe in science. That is absolutely not true. I absolutely believe in science. I don't always believe scientists. And I think I would be foolish to believe every scientist, because scientists can not only be people who are seeking truth, but they can also be people seeking power, position, money, tenure in colleges and whatever. They're not beyond greed, and it's like nobody is, right? So I believe in science. I believe in the study of things material. There's nothing wrong with that. And I believe in evidences that come from those things. If I didn't believe in science, I wouldn't go to a doctor. I wouldn't have taken the steps that I took when it came to COVID-19. I wouldn't have tried to protect myself and did the things that I wouldn't have done those things. I was like, science. So for someone just to use a straw man type of argument, well, you Christians just don't believe in science. That's absolutely not true. It's just that when I've studied the evidences that science presents to me, it doesn't give me reason to believe that God doesn't exist. And as I said this morning, because science doesn't study the existence of God. Science studies material things. God is spiritual. So science doesn't go into the realm of and study into the realm of spiritual. It stays away from that. So science cannot disprove the existence of God. It can only prove or disprove that which it has studied. So when I look at my faith in God and what creates this stamina, this endurance, this strength, however you want to put it, in me, is because I know these things to be real. And I don't know them to be real, as I said, out of wishful thinking. It's based upon evidences. I accept this and believe in it because of the evidence presented. In the Gospel of John, one of the things that is clarified there and really at the forefront of the whole gospel, and I preached through the Gospel of John a couple of years ago, was the deity of Jesus. And so in our belief in God, one, and then our belief that Jesus is the Son of God, what's our evidence for that? But I don't believe it's any different than if you go to a court and the judge is asking people for evidence of why the person is guilty, evidence of guilt or evidence of innocence. What do they use? Well, somebody said this and somebody saw that. And that evidence often is enough to convict a person. And convict a person even to the point of you face the death penalty. People have been convicted on what is known as circumstantial evidence. Not anything that is really concrete, but if you just kind of put the prima facie kind of argument, if you just kind of put everything together, this is the way it's got to be. So we're willing to accept that kind of argument when it comes to important matters of society and court cases and so forth? Why is it that people are reluctant to accept that type of evidence when it comes to the existence of God or whether or not Jesus is who he claimed to be? In the Gospel of John, Jesus presents himself as the Son of God. And then it's not just because he says it that we accept it. It's because he produces evidence that shows that he is. Now, I believe without question that we would not accept Jesus to be the Son of God if Jesus never made that claim himself, right? Why would we be arguing that Jesus is or not the Son of God if that claim was never made by him? That is us putting something upon him. But he, in fact, did make the claim. And if he made the claim, the next question would be, all right, so you've made the claim. How do we know whether that claim is true or not? So tonight what we want to do is we want to take a look at some things in the Gospel of John as way of an introduction to this idea of creating belief in Jesus as the Son of God, and thus also making a connection to the existence of God himself, that he does in fact exist, that God is real. So going back and looking at the importance of this. Why is it important whether we believe in God, and why is it important whether or not Jesus is who he claimed to be? You know, in that study this morning, and I didn't want to make that too heavy where that becomes our sole reason for believing. We don't believe in God simply so that when tough times come, we don't have a death of despair. We don't kill ourselves either in a quick fashion or a slow manner. That's not what we look to as the benefit of our faith in God. Well, you know, I believe in God because I just don't want to become a person of depression and fear constantly. So I believe in God so I can get through that. No, that is part of it. I mean, part of the reason we believe in God is not for that, but that is a result of faith in God, right? Because we have faith in God because we know he's real. That is a benefit that comes from it, not the reason we seek it out. The reason we seek out God is because we know he's real. We know that the Bible is his word, and we accept the things written here. And we see the need to seek him out because of the things that are written here. So if you think about how important this is, this idea of belief in God, consider what God did to create this belief in us. First, as I mentioned this morning, the universe itself. The fact that we have such a vast plane of existence beyond the earth, beyond our solar system, beyond our galaxy, to where there is considered to be billions, if not trillions of galaxies out there. Massive, unconscionable space. We can't even fathom the space that exists out there. Nor the planets and the stars, and just it is beyond our comprehension. Yet it exists, it's out there, that's a reality. These things are here. And then to consider the fact that, according to the Gospel of John in chapter 1, the Word becomes flesh. God, the creator of all of these things out there, becomes flesh. He says in the Gospel of John chapter 1 and verse 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then in verse 14, John says, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Imagine that. Imagine the importance of that. God, the Creator, was willing to come, the Word, come in the flesh for a reason. And I believe this is a logical argument and applicable to us. The creation tells us of the existence of God. But the creation doesn't tell us what God wants from us. You see, that's what Jesus did. The Word became flesh to reveal God to us in a different way. Not just in the fact that I exist, but I have a plan and a will for you as my creation. And you, as my creation, have a need for me. So in the existence of Jesus, we now have insights into God we otherwise would not have. His life on this earth reveals to us things about God. In fact, that was his mission. Yes, certainly to save us from sin, But in that in itself, he's telling us that there is sin, that there is a disconnect between you and God, and that Jesus is the means to reconcile that there is a way back to God. Now, if we stop and we think about the sacrifice of Jesus, oh, Jesus died for me so my sins could be forgiven. True. But the message is there is a God, you're separated from him, and there's a way back to him. And this is the way that it happens. Without Jesus coming, we don't know that. Without Jesus coming in and revealing that to us, we don't know that. So when we take a look at the existence of Jesus, how important it is to us, he comes and he reveals to us who God is and God's will to us, so we can make this connection with him and thus follow what he desires. In fact, when you go to John chapter 20 and verses 30 and 31, John chapter 20 and verses 30 and 31. Therefore, many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. So we're told that the purpose of Jesus' coming and why this gospel was written is so that we would have eternal life by believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Now that goes back to God himself. Because if Jesus is the Son of God, then there has to be a God for him to be the son of. Right? If I have a father, then I'm human. I came from someone. Some other male had his part in my being here. Okay, I'm here. No one would conclude, other than Elon Musk, we all believe people are human. He may be an alien, I've been told on several occasions. But no one would believe somebody that say, where'd you come from? You're like, nowhere. You don't have a father? No, I don't have a father. Well, like, you're a human being. You're Homo sapien. You have a father. You came from somebody. So when Jesus claims to be the Son of God, he's not only supporting his deity, he's supporting the existence of God, that there is a God, and that he has come from that God to reveal to us the will of God. So John wants us to understand that God, in a demonstration of his great love, came to this earth in the Son to save us. You see, that's what the John 3:16 passage is all about. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever so believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. The whole thing was to create belief in us, create a belief that we have in Jesus as the Son of God, so that we might connect to God and have eternal life. But it's not enough. It's not enough, and it shouldn't be enough that we accept this on face value, because we do not. God never required that of us. I know some people want to just say, well, look, God said it, you should believe it, that's it. No, that's not true. You know why I know that's not true? Because God never said that. We've said that. People have said that. You've seen bumper stickers that say that. God said it, I believe it, that's it. Well, but why do you believe it? And did God actually say it? So God did not just tell us to believe in him in a blind faith. And people will say about, oh, Christianity is all about blind faith. No, it's not. No, it's not. You see, again, it has no sustainability in our lives if it isn't built upon evidences. We would abandon it. Our faith in God is built upon evidences. And when you go back and look at what Jesus did in the Gospel of John, what Jesus did in his life on this earth, what was he presenting to us? Evidences. He was giving us evidences. In fact, go to the book of Acts with me. In the book of Acts, in chapter 2, Peter, on that first gospel sermon he preaches on that day, makes this claim that God did not call us to believe in him in blind faith. He calls us to believe in him through evidences. In Acts chapter 2, beginning in verse 22. Acts chapter 2 and verse 22. Peter says, "Men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man attested to you by God with miracles and wonders and signs, which God performed through him in your midst, just as you yourselves know. This man, delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, you nailed to a cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death. But God raised him up again, putting an end to the agony of death, since it is impossible or was impossible for him to be held in its power." Now, do you hear what Peter is doing here? Peter's not going up and saying, "Look, men of Israel, Jesus said he was the Son of God and you killed him. You should have believed in him because he said he was the Son of God. You should have blindly accepted what he was saying to you because he said it." No. He says, this man, Jesus of Nazareth, was attested to you, witnessed that he was who he claimed to be, not by himself, not by his own words, but by what God did through him. Miracles, wonders, and signs. As you, he says, as you well know. And he didn't do it up in some faraway country. You see, there's these faith healers out there today that want you to believe in them. Believe that I can, well, how come I've never seen you? Well, you know, in other countries they're doing this. Well, I never see this in other countries. It doesn't happen here, but it happens other places. Listen to what he says. He says, this man, delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, you nailed to a cross. You did it. He says, he performed them in your midst. He did these miracles in front of you. You saw it. So God isn't asking us to believe in him blindly. That is not a faith that is sustainable. It's not. And God knows that. Why is the creation so vast? Why is it so complex? Imagine that. Could God have made the creation simple? Certainly he could have. Could he have made it much smaller? Without a doubt. Why so large? Because it explains something about him, who he is as a God. If this creation is as large as it is, the one who brought it into existence is bigger than it. Now, I'm not talking about size. I'm talking about greater in power, greater in might. You look at the complexity of just the human body and the different parts of that, the complexity of the solar system, the fact that we stay where we do, the laws of nature, the complexity of all those things. That gives us intelligent design. That tells us that the God who brought this into existence is an intelligent individual. So he's never asked us to believe in him blindly, to have faith in him. Because he knows we will not be sustained with that. It won't take very much for someone to come along, even if it's just mere peer pressure, to get us to abandon our belief in him if all we have is, God said so, and I believe it. If that's all you've got, then you will not be faithful to him. There has to be more than that. And I don't think I'm out of place to say that God understood that about us. Why else did he give us all the evidences? Why did Peter in that first sermon tell them, you saw this yourself? Now, the rejection has nothing to do with what they saw. The rejection has to do with their heart. But they cannot deny what they saw. In fact, when you go back after the resurrection of Jesus in Acts in chapter 5, we know, or in chapter 3 and then 4 and 5, they go before the Sanhedrin court. In chapter 3, we had the lame beggar being healed. And one of the things that the Sanhedrin noted was that a notable miracle had taken place. You see, they couldn't deny that the lame beggar was now walking. They couldn't deny it. That word notable means that the evidence is clear. So it wasn't, the rejection has nothing to do with the evidence. The rejection of these people at the time has to do with their desire not to accept the evidence. And it didn't matter how powerful it was. In fact, in Luke chapter 16, when you consider the story of Lazarus and the rich man, do you remember what Abraham says to the rich man when he asked him to send Lazarus back to his family? To warn them of this place? Jesus says, and this is Abraham speaking to the rich man, they have the law and the prophets. He says, if they do not believe them, they will not believe what? Even if a man comes back from the dead. So Jesus is saying, it's not the evidence that is lacking. It's not the evidence. Even if Lazarus were to come back from the dead and say, look, I saw your brother, I saw your son, he's in torments, they wouldn't believe him. And Jesus was making that statement as well about himself. Even if I'm resurrected from the dead, even though the evidence is overwhelming, there will be some who will not believe. So it's not a lack of evidence. In fact, it's the evidence that we have that creates this belief in God. Jesus is the revelation of God. When we look at what he came to do, what he taught, he reveals to us a God that we would not otherwise know. Now, certainly we can go back and we can consider the Old Covenant. We can consider the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's the same God. But the things that Jesus revealed to us were things that were not revealed to them. At least not in the same way. They saw these things as a mystery. They didn't fully comprehend the salvation of humanity through the Son of God. They misunderstood that. They didn't fully comprehend, even though the prophets were prophesying about the death of Jesus, that wasn't something that they fully understood what it meant. So when we get to the Christ and we see his life here on earth, what he becomes then to us is a revelation of God, that God does exist, that God is real, and that God has a plan for us. Consider why the Son of God is referred to as the Word. Why in the Gospel of John, in chapter 1, when John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, consider the fact that the Son of God is referred to as the Word. What does that mean? Well, the word conveys communication. That's what words do. They communicate. They convey messages. So the Word, Jesus, is a messenger of God. If you're a messenger of God, that must imply that there is a message to be delivered. There's something to be said. Now, how great and how small depends on who the person is and who they're coming from. You know, the message from my neighbor may not be as important as the message from my governor. May not be as important as the message from God, right? Jesus is the Word, God, and he becomes flesh. He comes to convey and reveal to us a revelation of God. The work of the Son was to reveal God to us in a way that had not previously been done. The work of the Son was to help us understand him in a way that we never could. Imagine understanding the love of God without the sacrifice of Jesus. Could you really comprehend the love of God without the sacrifice of Jesus? Because Paul says in Romans chapter 5 and verse 8 that God demonstrates his own love toward us. And while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Now, consider the connection there. A righteous God was willing to come to this earth and be sacrificed for an unrighteous people. That would be, and I'm going to do a lesson on this on Wednesday on loving your enemy. And in fact, in verse 10, we're reminded that we were enemies of God when this happened. I read this article, and this is what my lesson, I'm not going to get into my lesson, I'm just going to give you this as a little kind of a taste of it. 20 years ago, there was this white supremacist group that was out there doing its nonsense. And across a bunch of people in the community got together and decided to go and protest the white supremacist group. And one of the guys in the white supremacist group made his way around and got into this group of primarily black citizens. Well, they attacked the guy. They were beating him down. There is a picture of a young black lady who threw herself on top of this white supremacist. Because even though this man was her enemy, she had compassion for him. That gives us a little bit of an insight into the love of God. Because this is a righteous God who throws himself in front of death for an unrighteous people. So without Jesus coming, I don't think we could really have fully comprehended the love of God. Not in the way that we do when we look at what Jesus did for us. This Word of God is the same as God. So Jesus, when you take a look at who he is, he's not some created God. He is God. Jesus, the Word, revealed to us God because he is God. He could reveal to us the nature of God because he has that divine nature. Note this terminology that we find in the Gospel of John that Jesus uses in reference to himself to create this belief in who he is, and thus a deeper belief in who God is. In John chapter 8 and verse 58, Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am." Before Abraham was born, Jesus says, I am. Now look, if Jesus is not God in the flesh, then he's blaspheming. Because in that statement, he's showing that before Abraham existed, he existed. But he didn't exist as the Son. He didn't exist as Jesus. He existed as the I am, the Word, God. John chapter 10 and verse 30. Jesus says, I and the Father are one. That phrase, are one, means in essence. Not kind of alike because we look alike. Don't I look like my dad? No. Jesus didn't look like his dad physically. Jesus looked like us physically. But his essence, his nature, the claim that Jesus makes here, that he and the Father are one, are not just like we agree and we get along. He says, in nature and essence, we are the same. I am God is what he's claiming. And then in John chapter 14, beginning in verse 7. John 14, verse 7. We'll go down through verse 9. He says, if you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on, you know him and have seen him. Philip said to him, Lord, show us the Father, and it is enough for us. Jesus said to him, have I been so long with you, and yet you have not come to know me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Jesus is telling us that he is a messenger of God, revealing to us who God is through his life, through his words, through his actions, through his mere existence, through the miracles that he performed. His statements attest to that. And the Hebrew people of the time understood that. In fact, that was one of the reasons the Jewish leaders wanted to kill him. They never believed that Jesus was claiming to be a God. They never believed that Jesus was claiming to be a created being. That would not have been something they would have been so upset over as to try to kill him. They were upset with him because he was claiming to be equal to God, to the Father, thus making himself to be deity. They understood that. And I think the text bears out for us that we can understand that as well. Look over in John chapter 5. John chapter 5. Verse 16. For this reason the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But he answered them, my Father is working until now, and I myself am working. For this reason, therefore, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him. Listen, verse 18, John 5. Because he not only was breaking the Sabbath, which he wasn't, but also was calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. And they weren't wrong in that part. Oh, they were wrong about him breaking the Sabbath. Jesus would have been a lawbreaker and a sinner if he would have done that. He wasn't breaking the Sabbath. But they were right in the accusation that he was making himself equal to God because he claimed God as his own personal Father. Remember, the Jews never made the claim of my Father. Their claim was always our Father. Because to make the claim of my Father was to make a personal connection, and thus to establish yourself as being related to him in some fashion or form. Jesus makes that claim. And when they accuse him of it, he never denies it. He doesn't say, no, you guys are getting it wrong. I'm not really here to reveal to you God. I'm not really here to show you who the Father is. I'm just saying he's like my Father, kind of like he's your Father. I'm sorry, I said that incorrectly. You misunderstood me. No, he never denied it. In fact, he repeated it, that he was in fact who he claimed to be. So when you go back and you take a look at the Gospel of John and note what Jesus came to do, his work was to reveal God to us. It was to, as John writes in the close of this gospel, to create belief that he is the Son of God. That he is in fact God who came to reveal to us his will and to save us. When you go and you look at the things that Jesus compares himself in with God, I'm going to do this very quickly here. But I want you to listen to these things, and you can write these down if you want. Listen to the comparisons Jesus makes here in regard to himself and the Father. In John chapter 5 and verse 19, he states that the Father and the Son do the same work. In John 5:21, the Father and the Son have the power to resurrect. In John 5 and verse 22, the Father and the Son have the right to judge. In John 5:23, the Father and the Son are deserving of equal honor. In John 5:24 and 25, the Father and the Son have the power of regeneration. In John 5:26, the Father and the Son are self-existent. Jesus makes these claims that he and the Father are equal in these areas. What's he telling us? He's telling us that God is real, and he's the proof of that. So when it comes to our faith in God, our belief in God, the faith that sustains us, we're not putting our faith in something that has no evidence behind it. That would be utter foolishness for us to do that. It would be a waste of life. In fact, even Paul writes that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. He said, if there is no resurrection of the dead, what? We are above all men most to be pitied. We are foolish individuals to believe in something that never happened. To commit our life, our treasure, to abandon family, jobs, to give up all of that for something that is fake, a myth. That's why we don't follow God, simply because God said it, I believe it, that's enough. God said, that's not enough. It's not enough for you. I'm going to give you evidences so that your faith will be sustainable, so that you won't give up under times of pressure, under pandemics, or loss of loved ones, or illnesses that ruin your life, physically, mentally. You won't give up under the pressure of those things. You won't abandon faith in me. Because your faith in me is not wishful thinking. It's not built upon, God said it, I accept it. It's built upon, God said it, I accept it, because he's shown me he's real. That's why I accept it. Because he's proven himself to me in the creation and in the Son. That is real faith. That is a faith that will sustain you. In the Gospel of John, John made it very clear that what Jesus came to do was to be the revelation of God to us, so that we would have reason to accept him and believe in him. And is not the resurrection also one of those things? Without the resurrection of Jesus, why do we have hope in a resurrection ourselves? If Jesus made all these claims, went to the tomb and died and stayed in that, or died and went to the tomb and stayed in that tomb, then there's no reason to believe in a resurrection. That's what Paul was saying in 1 Corinthians. Look, if he's not resurrected, we're not resurrected. So Christians don't believe in God without evidences that God is real. We believe in God and we accept him as God because he's proven himself to be God through the creation and through the work of his Son. And in that gospel, and in the beginning of the work of the church, that was the argument that was used. Why do you think in Acts chapter 9, Jesus appeared to Saul because Saul needed no evidence of the existence of Jesus? Oh, you know what, Saul, you should have just believed because I said I was Jesus. He appears to him after his death, after his resurrection. And what convinces Saul to abandon his persecution of the church and then to lay down his life for the church? What transpired that changed that? Because Jesus said it? No. Because the evidence, Jesus appeared to him. And then he could no longer doubt. That's what sustained him through all of his hardships. Because he knew without question that Jesus is who he claimed to be. And so do we.